Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by two of my colleagues. Hermann, who has come fresh from a haircut. Hermann, Pretorius, how are you, sir?
I am more aerodynamic than I was this morning.
I like that. It's very good. And Mr. Marius Roodt, our watchman, the watchman of liberty in the East Rand. Marius, how are you?
How's it, Nick? How's it, Hermann?
So let's get started off on this fine Tuesday with a story that I think it's a kind of story that's very common in South Africa, but it's really not talked about that much, despite how common it is. And this is very much one of those kind of two different South Africas coexisting together kind of thing. And this is that in Philippi, there has been another mob justice attack, or at least suspected mob justice attack. A suspected robber was set alight, and this is the fourth such mob attack in the past week. He was found in Brown's Farm yesterday. On Sunday, a 23-year-old man was stoned to death, allegedly by an angry mob, after being accused of attempting to rob a resident in Philippi. On Friday, an unidentified man was found on the street after allegedly being beaten to death, after being accused of attempting to steal a cell phone. And on last Monday, so just over a week ago, a man was burnt and stoned to death after being accused of stealing clothes. This is really brutal stuff. And the police say they're investigating the people responsible for this. But often in these cases, very few people are willing to stand properly as witnesses. And often the cases kind of fall through the cracks. So, Hermann, I want to start with you and just say, am I right to characterize this sort of thing as a common event in South Africa? What do you think this tells us about South Africa?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It is tragically a very common event. Well, not very. It is common. I think one of the challenges we have is really just having good data to go on. Much of this is anecdotal. It's sort of like sexual violence in South Africa. The reporting is probably minuscule compared to the actual crimes and the actual problems faced. If you think about the very rural parts of South Africa, and South Africa being a relatively large country, has vast swathes of rural areas, and the utter lack of police infrastructure and law and order there, it's very likely for two reasons that this contributes to this vigilantism problem. Number one, you don't have police to maintain law and order, or you do have police, but the communities don't trust them. And secondly, it also is this issue that many of these vigilante mob justice acts are probably not even reported to police in the first place, because had there been moderately competent police, the mob justice in the first place would have been less likely to occur. But even on the data we have, and the most recent data, unfortunately, I have is from 2018-19, there were 54 deaths in that year of vigilantism deaths in police custody, and then 214 deaths total in police custody. So, I mean, it's difficult to work with this data and to contextualize it. But I do think anecdotally, all of us have spoken to South Africans who live in communities that don't trust the police or don't have police. And I remember working for the DA's election campaign, and all of my colleagues came from Khayelitsha. In the build-up to the 2019 election, bar one or two, but most of my colleagues were from Khayelitsha, and their stories of casual murder and casual lives taken for sins against the community or for crimes against the community was common, and not something to write home about. And I think this really indicates a state failure, and it sort of also illustrates where this failure really falls heaviest, because just before we were recording, I mentioned that we have almost 100,000 police officers in South Africa, but we have 500,000 private security guards. that someone from the middle class like myself can pay to do what I pay taxes for the police to do. So I have this double expenditure because I have the capacity to pay both taxes and a private police company. But the poorest South Africans, most South Africans, don't have that luxury. So when the state fails to keep them safe, there's no fallback, there's no market, there's no privilege available to poor South Africans, black, white, colored, Indian, doesn't matter. There's no fallback if the government, the state, the police fails you. And I think this type of mob justice really is just indicative of the extent of state failure.
Right. I remember a colleague I worked with, I think it was at the Daily Sun, who said, mob violence was such a common thing in the part of Soweto that she lived in that whenever it happened, she just sort of closed the door because that was all you could do. Because if you interfere, you risk becoming a victim of the mob as well. So she would just kind of try and ignore it. And, it really does. I think South Africa is a very violent place. We see that in pretty much all the statistics. And as a result, when people are they feel so oppressed and so beaten down by crime all the time, that these explosions of anger happen, and because the police don't do their job. Marius, what's your takeaway from this story? What do you think we should think about it?
Yeah, I think Hermann hits the nail on the head. It's a symptom of state failure. But I also think when you're reading through what the people had allegedly stolen, a cell phone, clothes, or whatever the case is, these are really, they're petty crimes, but also shows you that level of desperation. Somebody who has maybe, 2 or 3 T-shirts stolen, that might be the entire wardrobe. And it's, it's not easy for them just to pop down to Mr. Price and spend 200 Rand on, a couple more T-shirts or a cell phone. I'd be pretty upset if my cell phone got stolen, but whatever, I'll just go get a new one. It's not that easy for a lot of other people. If their cell phone gets stolen, that's, they might have saved and scrimped for a long time to get a cell phone. It's probably a prized possession. It's some, they're one of their way they're trying to find work or whatever the case is. So it also shows you that people are getting murdered for for pretty much petty crimes. And, obviously nobody can condone this vigilante justice and people getting killed. But also, as you say, I think Nicholas is, it's these explosions of anger that happen. People are fed up, and as I say, you can't condone any of this. But it's also it's must be very careful when we judge these kinds of incidents. And this goes to a much deeper problem in South African society, I think. And there's also something I've spoken about before. South Africa is one of the most violent countries in the world, but we also, we're not unique in being a post-colonial special, use ANC language as colonialism of a special type, but we're not unique in a post-colonial, as being a post-colonial country. We're not unique in being quite a ethnically diverse country. We're not unique in being a country with high levels of inequality or poverty or unemployment. So there's something deeper there. We are, I think, out of countries with more than 20 million people, we are the 3rd most violent society in the world after Brazil and Venezuela. And Venezuela is basically a failed state. So it tells you something we need to, there's something sick in South African society.
I think we might be ahead of Brazil at the moment. South Africa.
So we're winning at something, which is great.
We're still not beating Venezuela in that country.
Rugby World Cup and violence, great.
So our colleague Gabriel Krause often likes to point out that in surveys done of South Africans, the police are routinely the least trusted South African institution. So Hermann, I think to close this off, I'm going to throw the question to you and say, if you were, emperor, president, Republican leader, whatever of South Africa, what would you do to try and stop vigilante killings, turn around the police, and get the country feeling safe again?
Well, I think accountability really must be the thing. It's really asks the question: how can you get law and order forces to be accountable to the people that they should keep safe? And one of the policy suggestions the IR has put out there is elected station commanders. Now, that's an idea that really hasn't been tested in South Africa at all. Interestingly, the Nats with the prosecuting authority, sort of decentralized and federalized in the early 90s. This idea that you had, for each province, you had a prosecuting authority and a big chief there. And then that was rolled back in the mid-90s. So I do think that federalism, making power as, making government as close to the people as possible through direct elections or direct accountability mechanisms would be the way to go about this. But I just want to add another thing that Gabriel always also points out, is that Marius uses the example of someone having a cell phone stolen. Well, if from a very middle class perspective, one of the most obvious signs of a small business initiative is these set up shops in malls and in bigger, commercial buildings of your little cell phone nook or your fixer of gadgets and small mobile electronics. And the problem is, if you have a crime and if people are getting their cell phones stolen, just very simply, the economic opportunities to cater to an area that is poor but needs cell phones is made so much more difficult, because no person selling cell phones, no person selling assets that are vulnerable can go into that community and cater for the needs and desires of that community. So the crime situation is not just a problem of private citizens losing what they have and therefore having to replace or not being able to replace what they lost. It's also, there's a massive economic opportunity cost there, because basic needs of citizens cannot be addressed because people willing or able in a position to address those needs cannot go close to those areas, making the product or the service available to those people simply for being at the risk of losing everything they have. So accountability as quickly as possible, as severely as possible, and then also checks and balances structures. I think IPID is a shadow of what it really should be.
Right, no, definitely. But the other thing, of course, is that the police would need to be cleaned of the organized crime elements that have been infiltrating it. And I think those are a serious part of why police officers often have such low morale, or often kind of seem to panic, because there's just the whole internal structure seems to be rotten. And until those organizational problems are fixed, beyond and above the policy suggestions that you've made, those would also need to be repaired.
Also, the minister in cabinet responsible for the police is, there's sufficient reason to think that he is guilty of corruption himself. So it's just you can't seek to address the moral fiber of law and order if you have people like Becky Taylor in government. It's just not possible. It's like putting a rapist in charge of fighting gender-based violence. Not that Becky Taylor is a rapist. It's just a fish rots from its head, and this head is pretty rotten.
No, definitely. But we must also remember that while we often talk about there were service delivery successes in the Mbeki administration, one of the key things I think to remember is that the destruction of the police actually, I think, fully began under the Mbeki administration, particularly with Jackie Philippi, who, of course, was a dodgy character, and he was a major part of our maintaining our police structures. Anyway, let us move on to the next one. So over the weekend, there was a elective conference that the Democratic Alliance hosted in KZN. The province was electing who was going to be its provincial leader and chairperson and all of those roles. The main candidates for the provincial leader were Francois Rogers and Nicole Graham. And Francois Rogers won that contest. But what was interesting to me about this story was how the media reported it. So the exact headline from Eyewitness News was, and this is a quote, "New KZN DA leadership, mostly white males, but Rogers insists it's diverse." And the news article then goes on to talk about the race and gender of basically all of the people elected to the positions, and then a quote from Rogers saying that in the end of the day, we believe in fitness for purpose, and that's what really inspires me, and I find it encouraging from delegates in the Congress And also a small quote saying that the former leader, Zwakele, congratulated Rogers and that Rogers was his preferred successor. Marius, what should we make of, firstly, this DA election, and secondly, and perhaps far more importantly, of the media's reaction to it, at least in this case, Eyewitness News' reaction to it?
There's a meme where there's a guy, you can see he's had a bad day and he's just like speaking to the interviewer, and I think it's the Chinese guy speaking Chinese, and the subtitle is, "It's also tiresome." And that's what you kind of feel like. I mean, like what I mean, what does it matter if there was a majority of white males picked? Most of the delegates weren't white males, and this is who they decided was ready to take the party forward in the province. Not that this should matter, but I was just looking at the DA's provincial leaders, and 5 out of 9 of them aren't whites. I mean, there's Bongikosi Madikizela down in the Western Cape. There's Jane Sithole in Mpumalanga, I think. I mean, you can go through the names. Not that it should matter, but the DA's elected people who aren't white and aren't male to leadership positions in other provinces. And I mean, it's not as if the entire executive is white males in Natal.
Right. If I can interrupt you there, I remember there was a time when I think both the EFF and the ANC, particularly on Women's Day, loved to launch big attacks against the DA for its apparent sexism. This was when Helen Zille was its leader, and so.
No, but it's also it's a form of newspeak. I've seen. I think it was a movie in the US where the cast was all Asian American. It was about some wedding, and then it won some award. And it's like the most diverse movie to ever win an award. No, but I mean, a movie where the cast is all Asian American is by definition not diverse. I mean, diverse has a specific meaning, and you can't just say. It seems to be, like diverse means like hardly any white people. So I mean, if it's like there should be a problem. We shouldn't be saying, oh no, there's too few white people in leadership positions, but we should also not be going, there's too many white people in leadership positions. But also with your thing about the ANC and the FF, or having these attacks, it's also whenever this is a bit of an aside, but you often see now in the US or whatever we get implored to vote for women, which is all fine. But I'd like to ask these same people, if Sarah Palin or Michelle Bachmann became the Republican candidate for president, would we still be implored to, vote for women? Or when Helen Zille was the leader of the DA, did a lot of the people who tell us we need women in leadership positions, were they voting for the DA? I'd hazard a guess and say no.
Right. This reminds me of the hilarious attempts to try and claim that Margaret Thatcher was in fact not a woman and therefore doesn't count because she didn't hold sort of socialist views. Hermann, what do you make of the story and the way the media covered it?
Well, I think that the media are clearly, they think black people are stupid, must be. I mean, I voted for a party with a black leader. Marius, Nick, have you voted for parties with black leaders?
I have, and for women in charge as well.
Okay. So clearly we are sophisticated. We can vote for people or for parties that don't look like us. So we are clearly, according to the media.
Well, I don't know if that counts, because I once voted for myself. Maybe it counts around.
Yeah, well, but Nick, to be fair, we don't know quite what you are. So clearly we are at a level of sophistication or a level of cognitive cerebral capacity that we can look at a candidate and go, you might not share my skin color, but I'm voting for you. And somehow the implication must be that black people are so stupid that they go into a ballot box and then they kind of look at the face on the ballot, and then they kind of, like you color match in a paint store. You just kind of color match to see which candidate fits your skin color, and then you vote. I mean, that's the only explanation we can have here from the media. If they say, white men being elected by largely black electorate. I mean, how stupid are they calling these black DA people? It's just, it's really, really quite insulting. And the South Africa ordinary South Africans are so far ahead of them. I mean, we've been doing polling for many years, and one of the constant answers and one of the questions we ask regularly is, do you care what the skin color of your child's teacher is or not? And 83% of Black South Africans say they don't care what the skin color of their child's teacher is, as long as the teacher is good. Now, show me a South African who honestly can differ from that. If they go into an operation room and there's a Black surgeon, do you know any real middle of the road majority representing South African who can say, I don't want a Black police officer. If I'm white, I don't want a white police officer. If I'm Black, firemen, teachers. I mean, where do you draw this line of actually saying that, now race starts counting? It's bogus, it's nonsense. And IOL, I mean, we don't really expect much.
Eyewitness News, not IOL.
Oh, Eyewitness News, really? That's insulting. I mean, I once had this conversation with Stephen Curtis. Now I like Stephen. I really do. He's a quality journalist in South Africa. But he once put to me the argument that Black athletes can only be coached and understood and led by Black coaches. And I just think that's so 20th century thinking of, the white man having to come over here and, educate the Black savage. It's just so demeaning. It just robs Black people of their agency in a way that would make Verwoerd proud. I think it's shocking.
But also, as I was saying with the issue of Newspeak, I mean, I was just looking at the different leadership of the parties now, and by any definition, the DA's leadership is the most diverse out of the three big parties in South Africa. Then it's actually the EFF, because about half the leadership is made up of women. Then it's the ANC, because, they're the top 6, 5 are Black men, and there's 1 colored woman. But also, not that this should matter. These people were elected by the delegates of the various parties, and the ANC, even for their lack of diversity, they're still the biggest party in the country. So the electorate doesn't really care about diversity, it seems.
But I must say that this is one thing that the DA and even the IR, perhaps, I don't know, many South Africans make this mistake of playing the racist game and that's the problem that I think plagued the DA for about a decade preceding the resignation of Mmusi Maimane, that they tried to blunt the attacks. They tried to play the race game in South African politics. And the problem is, in any debate or in any conflict of visions, if you start adopting the measurements of success of your opponent, you are 70% to losing that engagement. The real trick here is for the DA to say, we don't really care. I mean, we've got white men in our leadership. Tough. Alan Winde is a white guy. He's heading up the province with the best performance on almost every conceivable measure. The DA should just say, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And if you care about the race of our leader or our leadership, you're the racists. And that's ironically something that upset Phumzile van Dam and Magashule Ghana when in October 2019, I accidentally, became relevant.
But also, most of these people complaining about the race of Francis Rogers, whatever his name is, they're very unlikely to vote DA anyway. So, the DA should stop worrying about people you're not going to vote for them anyway.
Right, it's a criticism made in very bad faith. And that's, you can see that in that when the DA does have, when it did have Black leaders in, I think, almost every single province, and when its federal leader was a Black leader, there was no credit at all given to the party on this. It was, there's just puppets of the white interests. Because what these critics really mean when they say you're not Black is they say you're not a sort of left-wing socialist who believes in racial nationalism. That's really what they mean.
One thing that I just want to add is someone tweeted once at Helen Ziller, white privilege is having a Black woman's policy ideas be attributed to a white woman. And that's essentially saying that it was in reaction to a Gwen Ngwenya situation, because Gwen Ngwenya is literally the policy brains of the DA. Think of her what you will, but I mean, she's the DA's head of policy. She's literally the DA's head of the kind of its approach to solutions. And people kept saying, well, look, Helen Ziller is a white woman. This is her beliefs and this is her policy. Meanwhile, Helen had really no hand in drawing up these policies in many instances. They were the result of Gwen Ngwenya's work. And it's just so absurd that when we have someone that should tick the woke boxes, a Black woman in a position of real influence and real power in a party, literally directing its thinking, it's not even spoken about. It's not even spoken about. But let's spend inches, column inches, on discussing how white men in KwaZulu-Natal is somehow, a problem in the country.
There's a very sinister kind of I want to say not movement, kind of sinister way of thinking amongst some people on the left, certainly not all of them, but some of them, where your race is basically determined by what you think. I mean, I actually tweeted about it this weekend. There was a British academic, a guy called Clive Gabay, where somebody had tweeted about somebody had said baffled at the behavior of non-white Trump supporters. Woke writers have coined the term multiracial whiteness to explain away the inexplicable. Now, this academic guy, called Clive Gabay, tweeted to this saying, "The feels when you can't think of race as anything but the color of someone's skin." I mean, that is literally all race is. It is only the color of your skin. It's got nothing to do with how you think or your culture or what. I mean, of course, there's some overlap between race and culture and so on. But I mean, your race is the way you think has absolutely nothing to do with your race. You can get liberal blacks, you can get socialist whites. I mean, it's also the way I've seen black people. So you call them conservatives broadly. So Sikhla Ngobesi called their scaries on Twitter disgusting. But it's the same way of thinking in the old days when Afrikaner nationalists or racists, whatever you called white people who thought apartheid was a bad thing, called them Kaibutis. It's exact same type of thinking, saying, how can you as a white person think that black people deserve equal rights? It's completely disgusting, and it actually makes my blood boil when people think like this.
And we are months away from the left proposing Bantustans. I promise you, we are months away from the left proposing a Verwoerdian idea, and because we've already seen it happening.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because some of the more radical groups in the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, now this is not a characterization of all of them, but there were definitely some there who were saying things like, we need to make a Black America. In fact, this idea is quite old, even in the US. I think the Black Panthers, which is a sort of militant racial nationalist group, I believe they had meetings with the Ku Klux Klan at some point.
Yes.
Where there was actually to split America into black and white states.
They actually wanted to look at making some of the southern states with large black populations, Mississippi and so on, and create Bantustans there, and would have been called New Africa or something like that. There was a kind of this fringe idea. So, but I mean, this idea is probably not going to be so fringe if we're not careful.
It's really not going to be fringe pretty soon, because what the Verwoerdian idea is that people who look the same must think the same, therefore they must live in the same area because they will approach problems in the same way. That's textbook Verwoerdianism, and it's fascinating that Verwoerd's legacy casts a longer shadow than Verwoerd's policy. And every time a Black Lives Matter person or a wokeista is going to go this thing, I'm going to call them Verwoerdians, and I'm just like, Hendrik would be proud, Owens. Hendrik would be proud.
No, exactly.
Right. No, it's actually been quite terrifying that sort of last 10 years has seen a very concerted effort by people who supposedly are anti-racists to resurrect race and racism as legitimate concepts in our politics. And we've already seen a lot of bad consequences from this, but if the history of the 20th century is anything to go by, this is going to end very much in tears. I think it's fair to say. Right, we're coming up towards the end now, so we're not going to cover the last story, which was going to be about Hong Kong and how China has delivered the final blow to its political system there by essentially abolishing democracy.
But
that's pretty
Nick,
sad.
If I can quickly jump in there, that Hong Kong's existence up to now was such a good piece of evidence against the very Verwoerdianism that we just spoke of. I mean, they were Chinese people wanting democracy, not thinking like other Chinese people. The woke left must look at Hong Kong and just think, good, it's off the map, then we don't have to deal with that cognitive dissonance.
Right. But wokeness tends to not be particularly adept at explaining anything outside of the West, because it's so markedly focused. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much for listening. And we hope that you have a great week. We will see you tomorrow on the next episode of The Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.